Welcome everyone to the kickoff event for the campus read of An Education in Georgia, celebrating 60 years of integration at the University of Georgia. I am sitting in my office at the University of Georgia Press. I should introduce myself. I'm Lisa Baer, director of the press, in the third floor of the beautiful University of Georgia main library. And I know that we have attendees from the campus, from the community of Athens, and really from all over the world. So welcome and thanks for joining us. I would like to do just some quick thank yous because a team of us pulled this together fairly quickly, and it's been an exciting endeavor, something light and bright and important to work on in the new year. I would like to thank the University of Georgia for selecting this event as a signature lecture. I'd like to thank my colleagues at the University of Georgia Press who've worked so hard to make this entire month of our campus read happen. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication, the Mary Frances Early College of Education, the New Georgia Encyclopedia, the folks at the University of Georgia Libraries. And last but not least, I would like to thank the many individual donors whose gifts enabled us to provide over 100 free copies of Calvin Trillin's An Education in Georgia to students at the University of Georgia so that they can read along with us this month. Some housekeeping: if you have a question you would like to ask any of the speakers, put it into the question and answer, the Q&A module, and it will get to our moderator.
Yeah, you can see it.
Speaking of, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Valerie Boyd. Valerie is the Charlayne Hunter-Gault Writer in Residence and Associate Professor of Journalism at the Grady College at the University of Georgia. She is also the founder and director of the university's singularly unique low residency MFA in non-narrative fiction. Thank you all. Over to you, Val.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thanks for that introduction. Welcome to everyone who's participating with us today. I am very excited to be able to moderate this conversation between two legendary journalists, Charlayne Hunter-Gault and Calvin Trillin. And I'll start out by just introducing them a little bit. I think you all probably have read Calvin Trillin's book, An Education in Georgia, so you're familiar with Mr. Trillin and with Ms. Hunter-Gault, but I'm going to do short bios, short intros of them, and then we'll get started with the conversation. So Calvin Trillin is a staff writer for The New Yorker, where he's worked since 1963, when the magazine published a series of pieces called An Education in Georgia, his account of the desegregation of the University of Georgia. And of course, those series of pieces became the book that you all have now read. More than 400 of Trillin's pieces have appeared in The New Yorker. His work includes comic pieces and a wide variety of nonfiction, but his principal interest has been reporting on America, all corners of America. Between 1967 and 1982, he wrote a series of pieces from various locations within the country called U.S. Journal. He has published two collections from this series, U.S. Journal, a book that was published in 1971, and Killings, which was published in 1984 and reissued with new material in 2017. He followed that series with a series of longer narrative pieces under the heading American Chronicles. And a collection of those pieces called American Stories was published in 1991. Calvin Trillin started his career as a journalist after serving in the Army as a reporter for Time magazine. He spent a year in their Atlanta bureau covering the civil rights struggle. And of course, that's when he met Charlayne Hunter-Gault and Hamilton Holmes. After returning from the South in 1961, he wrote for Time in New York, an experience that eventually served as background for his comic novel, 1980's Floater. From 1978 to 1985, he wrote a humor column for The Nation, The column was syndicated in newspapers from 85 to 95. His columns have been collected in 5 books, and he continues to contribute comic verse to The Nation magazine. In all, Calvin Trillin has published 31 books, including 3 comic novels and a collection of his pieces on race over 50 years called Jackson 1964. That was published in 2016. He's also known as a food writer. His writings about eating, which began as sort of comic relief from his more serious reporting, have been published in 4 books: American Fried, Alice Let's Eat, Third Helpings, and Feeding a Yen. Calvin Trillin, as you can tell, is a Renaissance man, an amazing writer, and he also has done 2 one-man shows, and he continues to travel widely as a public speaker. Charlayne Hunter-Gault, as many of you know, is a Peabody and Emmy Award-winning journalist with more than 50 years of experience. She has worked in the media industry on practically all its platforms, including print, television, and radio work at such esteemed media outlets as The New Yorker, The New York Times, NBC, PBS, NPR, and CNN. She is also the author of 4 books, including In My Place, an autobiography that explores partly her time at the University of Georgia, and To the Mountaintop, My Journey Through the Civil Rights Movement. Her upcoming book is a collection of her almost 60 years of print journalism, writing about Black people's lived experiences. The book will be called My People: 5 Decades of Writing About Black Lives. She continues to work with PBS NewsHour on a special series called Race Matters, and she is a highly sought after lecturer and moderator. And Charlayne is the wife of former banker Ronald Gault and the mother of 2 children, Susan, an artist and singer, and Chuma, an actor and director. So those are our 2 dynamic speakers. Welcome, Charlayne and Calvin. I'm going to call you Bud because everybody calls you Bud. Is that okay?
That's fine. Thank you.
Good. Thank you both for joining us. I am honored to be here and be a part of this conversation with you both.
Well, thank you so much for having us. That's what everybody says on television every night. Thank you so much for having me. I wish I could be more original, but thank you for having me.
My pleasure. It's great. So, Charlayne, in the intro to An Education in Georgia, and you see my book has post-its from where I read it and wrote all kinds of questions. But in the intro, you write about the day you first met Calvin Trillin on the campus of UGA. I'm going to read a little bit of that. You talk about all the different journalists who were on campus yelling out questions to you, while students who didn't want you all on campus were yelling out epithets. But you talked about one journalist standing out because he sort of stood back and was unobtrusively moving through the crowd, kind of getting the real story from just making himself a part of what was taking place. But you wrote, one day, shortly before 8 o'clock on a cold January morning, trench coat flapping in the wind, hair falling down over his eyes. He had more hair in those days. Notebook in hand, and a gentle smile as he caught my eye. Calvin Trillin stood waiting as I went to my psychology class in Meigs Hall, campus escorts in tow. He introduced himself as Bud Trillin. I don't think I've ever heard him or anyone else who really knew him call him Calvin. And it seemed the perfect name for this completely unpretentious and self-effacing man from time. In fact, I think it was his lack of airs of self-importance that led me to trust him almost immediately. He may have had views of his own, but he always seemed more interested in mine. And then later in the same section, you write that he called you while you were there in the dorm alone. He called you and you went out to the hallway to answer the call, and you heard, "Hi, it's Bud. How'd you like to have a pastrami sandwich?" You write, "I was too relieved for words. All I could do was laugh." "You having a good time in there, kiddo?" he asked. And of course, I unburdened my soul. In the end, I declined the pastrami sandwich, but I went back to my room, feeling that I had a friend out there somewhere. So Charlayne, talk a little bit about how Bud established that sense of trust with you and how that began your friendship.
Well, thank you for reading those sections because at my age, I have trouble remembering things, but I will never forget a few things about those early days at UGA. And to be sure, because I also was there because I wanted to be a journalist, I was very busy a lot of the time, not paying attention to the ugliness around me, but watching the journalists watch me. And as you just indicated, some of them stood out, but they didn't stand out because they were yelling questions like we hear all the time nowadays, especially in the press conferences of famous and important people. But Bud didn't do that. And there were those who were yelling questions, but the yelling just got to me. It didn't rattle me, but I didn't like it because it seemed like some were more interested in their questions than my answers. And so from very early on, I began to learn things from Bud, who was covering me. But he was probably shorter than a lot of the other journalists. But you'll remember if Fred Powledge was there. I don't remember quite. He probably was, but he was very tall. And there were journalists of all heights. And Bud is about what, 5'5", 5'6", something like that. But he just stood out. And his eyes were one of the things that got me because he was watching. He was always looking. And I think that's what good journalists also do. They observe. I don't like the word objective, but I like observe because it helps you to see things that if you observe with good intentions, that is to produce good news that people can use, you need to observe. And that's what Bud did. He for the longest time, I would see him around, but he didn't ask any questions. And then, as you said, I got used to seeing him. And then one night the phone rang and he asked, being Jewish and from New York and into pastrami sandwiches, he said, and that just did it for me. And so, while on the one hand, I think that journalists always have to be careful about getting too close to their subjects, at the same time, you want to be able to reveal them in as many of their manifestations as you can. And I think that watching Bud watch me enabled him to do that, not just to me, but to Hamilton Holmes, my classmate, and others around the campus. And then again, he would travel to Atlanta to get more background on both of us. But it was on that campus in those first few days that he made the kind of impression on me that would just stay with me forever.
So Bud, here's what you wrote in that First Time magazine piece about going to class with Charlayne. You wrote, in her first class at the University of Georgia last week, pretty Negro co-ed Charlayne Hunter, 18, heard a psychology lecture on human behavior. The subject was timely, for that morning, she and Hamilton Holmes, 19, breached a sorry human behavior barrier, the 175-year-old tradition of segregation at the campus in Athens.
Well, I should say first that Time magazine in those days was practicing what was called group journalism. So people in the field, called correspondents, would write 20-page files, and some writer in New York would take that and put it into 70 lines, and maybe his editor would put it into 70 different lines. So I explained to Charlayne that pretty Negro co-ed had actually originally been silly Negro co-ed, Charlayne Hunter, and it had been rewritten in New York. I thought that when she said that I stood out, I thought it was, she would say, because I seemed so obviously dashing. But I guess that's not what she meant. I'm just amazed that she still had any trust in me after I offered her a pastrami sandwich. She says, where was I going to find a pastrami sandwich in Athens, Georgia?
I know, you almost lost your whole credibility right there.
Exactly.
Tell me what your impressions were. This is what you wrote or what somebody at Time wrote, but what did you think? What did you think about this young co-ed who was bold enough to integrate the University of Georgia, but doing so with what you later also wrote about, a kind of ease and a kind of comfort with herself in almost any situation?
Well, I think she's mentioned part of it is that she was sort of looking at this as a way to observe reporters, as opposed to the people who were yelling at her. And I should say about the people yelling at her, for a television news reporter, that's part of the act. You have to see that, and one of the disadvantages they have is that they can't ask dumb questions, which are very valuable in reporting, obviously. I thought obviously she was quite brave. I mean, as we walked around the campus with her, and Vernon Jordan was often with us. He was then sort of paralegal with Don Holloway, the main lawyer from Atlanta. And Vernon's pretty big. I tried to stay behind him, between him and anybody who was going to throw a brick. I mean, I wanted him in front of me all the time. So I was sort of, I like to think of it in his shadow. No, I thought she was, the amazing thing about Hamilton and Charlayne both was that they were the sort of popular kids in the class. They were the leaders and the cheerleaders and the presidents of the student council and everything. And so they were in a way giving up more than they would if they had been sort of wallflowers stuck with a book in the library, because they weren't going to have a normal life that they were expected to have. So I thought, yeah, I thought that they both wanted something. I think, and the thing that amazed me when I look back on why they had decided on Georgia, because the people who were sort of organizing this thought it would be easier to go to one of the universities in like Georgia State that was in Atlanta, and it would be easier. Is that they wanted to go for the same reason that white kids wanted to go. That was the bellwether institution. So that was in its own sort of surprising, at least to me, that they expected, I think, normalcy. But I've always thought, and that's why I wrote that book, or those pieces that became a book, is usually in those days, desegregation was a snapshot. You saw what was either a riot or not a riot, or peaceful or whatever it was. That was it. But in a way, that's very brave for those people. But the brave part is the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, and I thought that should be written about, and that's where I thought a lot of the bravery came in.
Right. So your book actually was published originally in 1964. The piece,
right.
I guess, yeah. So you followed them for about 3 years, but you came back after they had graduated. And so that relates to what you just said about really wanting to note their bravery and how this moment of desegregation was more than a moment and how it affected them ongoing. So, you've written about a lot of American stories. Tell us more about why this one. Why was this worthy of a book?
Well, partly, I think, I didn't think anybody had written it before. Had written about not just that they were there, but how they got there, what kind of families they came from, well, what it was like day to day when they were there. So I thought, nonfiction writers are always looking for um, pieces that nobody's done before. And originally, I thought when I was getting sort of restless at time, I thought of going back to the South and trying to write a series of pieces that just presented people as individuals rather than as groups or as photos in these brief moments of fame. Um, and then it just narrowed it down to, because Charlayne and Hamilton were about to graduate because they had come in as middle of the year sophomores. So I thought it was an opportunity and I had talked to Charlayne on the phone, from time to time, but I think I may have been back to Georgia once or twice, but generally it was a chance to get reacquainted with him.
Charlayne, you write in that introduction, when Bud told me he wanted to return and write a book about our 2.5 years at Georgia, I wasn't in a very good mood. Every now and then, the isolation of the place just got to me, even without anybody bothering me directly. Bud was one of the few people I felt I could let my guard down with. So I told him to come on, as much for my own therapy as for his project. Talk a little bit about that isolation that you felt and the relief that talking about your story with Bud gave you.
I'm feeling a little of that now with the COVID crisis, but I think I got used to it. Actually, many years ago, I was, of course, an only child, so for 8 years, that is. And so some of that isolation was not that unusual, except that I was surrounded by so much hostility. At the same time, I did have friends. And I think it's important for me to say that there were some wonderful teachers, as well, professors, I guess I should say, as well as students. Might have been only a handful. Some were journalism students, some were in other disciplines, who befriended me from Jump Street. And I have to also say, Hamilton and I were two different people, and Bud can talk about his observations of that too. But I'm not sure I learned this until sometime later when I was talking to his children. But while I had a coterie of friends, mostly students in the journalism school, and a few of the really nice professors, one of whom did a great portrait of me that first term because I had nothing else to do but sit for a portrait, and he wanted to do it. It's now in the portrait gallery in Washington, D.C., and I'm in touch with his son. So I have these links, and of course, Hamilton regrettably is no longer with us, but I've learned from his family up close that Hamilton never made a single friend at the University of Georgia. His son has said that when we've been down for the Holmes Hunter lectures once a year. I heard him say that not too long ago. And I found it hard to believe given that I had friends. But the other thing about Hamilton, which was different from me, because my grades were all over the place. I just found one of my report cards over there, and I don't want anybody to see that. But Hamilton, with all of that isolation and ugliness, finished Phi Beta Kappa in a very challenging field, pre-med. But he never gained, as he and his family have reiterated, a single friend. What he would do at the end of a class, at the end of school day, he would go back to the Black family who housed him. Girls at that day, in those days, had to live on campus. I'm not sure that's the case anymore, but I lived on campus, and Hamilton lived with a Black family. I would say maybe 6 minutes from the campus. And, you know, he would leave school, go home to this Black family's place where he stayed, change clothes, and go play football with the boys in the hood. Because he wanted to play, he played football at Turner High School where we attended. And he wanted to play football at Georgia, but they wouldn't let him. They said either some of your teammates might want to hurt you, or some of the others football players from other Southern schools who have no Blacks, because we were the first 2 Blacks to desegregate a institution of higher learning in Georgia, if not the South. And so they wouldn't let him. So in order to play, he would go and play ball with the boys in the hood. He never made a single friend. And that still is very painful to me.
Well, I think there's several reasons for the way Hamilton approached the University of Georgia experience as opposed to Charlayne. One of them is that I think he came from a family that was very active, had desegregated some things itself, including golf courses, because they loved to play golf. And he was expected, there was great expectation for him. And I think he had the idea that, I think to put it crudely, that show the crackers, that he was going to go there and be an outstanding student. But his life was in Atlanta. He drove home every weekend. And he was very contained when I talked to him then. And he seemed like sort of an introvert. Unlike Charlayne, who I remember when I told her that I was coming down there, she said, this week is Brotherhood Week. I think I'll go stand out in the corner and see if anybody invites me to lunch. So, but Hamilton seemed quite introverted, very interior sort of person. And then some years later, I gave a speech in Atlanta, and a college friend of mine said he wanted to have some people over the evening before the speech, and was there anybody I wanted to invite? And I said, yeah, see if you can get Hamilton to come. I haven't seen him since he graduated. And Hamilton was from a family that was a very jolly, funny, animated family. His grandfather kept trying to shoot his age in golf, who was a doctor. His father, Holmes, who just greeted everybody on the street as he walked by. So anyway, Hamilton came to the party, and I sat and talked to him for quite a while, and I realized he's like the rest of his family in a different setting. In a familiar setting, he was jolly and funny, and I enjoyed talking to him. And I think part of it was the way he looked at the experience in Georgia, and part of it was that I think that even though this sounds odd since they threw bricks at Charlayne's dormitory, that he was more likely to get physically hurt than Charlayne was, that a boy, what we call then a boy, was more likely to get hurt than a girl. So I think he was sort of in his defensive crouch when he was at the University of Georgia a lot. And there were a couple of incidents that almost ended up in some kind of violence, but they didn't. And I think when he was freed, when he had shown the crackers, that he was a different sort of person.
And you know, that reminds me, Bud, that was one of the reasons they gave to say that he shouldn't play football. They were afraid he'd be killed out there on that field.
Right. And although there was a lot of nastiness and hostility toward you, it wasn't likely to end up by someone, a couple of guys jumping you in the hall and beating you up. So I think that was also part of the package.
Yeah. You know, Valerie, the other thing that probably gained Hamp more enmity, I mentioned a few minutes ago that my grades were all over the place because there were things that I was interested in. And when I was interested, I would really pursue them. And when I wasn't, well, you know, cum si, cum sa. But, you know, I think that before Hamp got there, especially in the biological sciences, the grades were made on a grade point. And so if you got 60 on a test, if that was the highest mark, that was the A. And so I think that generally on the curve, a lot of the curve was around there because, well, I won't say the reasons for that, but Hamp would start almost every test he took, he would get 97, 98, 99, if not 100. And there came a time when I wasn't doing well in biology, and I don't remember who it was. One of the good professors said, well, maybe you should get Hamp to, you know, help you because that's his field. And we would sit there and he would say, and he stuttered a little bit, and he would say, oh, okay, now it's time for you to focus. And he would say, okay, now what's the answer to this? And he'd read the question. And I said, Hamp, it's multiple choice. I can't deal with multiple choice. There are always exceptions. He said, do you want to pass this course or not? I mean, so we had that kind of relationship. I mean, he thought I was kind of silly and I thought he was kind of, you know, stuck up. But he did help.
Hey, silly is the word I used in that first file.
Yeah, I know you
Funny you
did.
should mention it.
And I could be silly, which partly helped me get over, you know, get through all of that. But and finding some humor in things. But you know, Hamp was if I tell you something that people looking at me being silly and Hamp being, you know, reserved. If anything happened to me, and I used to get a lot of stomach trouble, the first and only person who would come to the infirmary would be Hamilton. Now, we might have fallen out about me not paying attention to my biology lessons or whatever, but if I was sick, he was the first person to come. And if he needed me, like the night that we were suspended, quote unquote, for our own safety, the night of the riot, I guess this was about the third night of us being there. They brought me out of the dorm and drove me over to the house where he was staying, the Killian house. And Hamp's grandfather, whom Bud just referred to as the great golfer, had given him a car when we graduated from high school and getting ready to go to Georgia. So he could drive back and forth to Atlanta, 70 some miles it was then. And Hamp wanted to take the car. And there was the state patrol there that were going to whisk us to Atlanta and to safety. Well, I did not know what lay ahead of us along that road that had a reputation for having some not good characters there. Let's put it that way. And Hamp was determined to drive that car. Now, as I told you, Hamp thought that I could veer towards the silly. And I thought, okay, the only way I'm going to encourage him not to drive that car is to go a little bit crazy. And so I started jumping up and down and shouting, you can't drive the car, you can't drive. And he was embarrassed because I was doing this in front of these white people and in front of these policemen and all of these officials at UGA. And he didn't want them to see me like that. So he said, okay, I won't drive. So he left the car and we got spirited back to Atlanta safely. But you know, when we needed one another, we were there for one another. And I will always believe that one of the reasons he left us so early, we only now know about PTSD, but I don't know enough about it to know, but I have speculated that that was a traumatic time for him more than for me. Go ahead.
I think you're definitely right. It was a traumatic time. Also, Charlayne, did it ever occur to you that he came to visit you in the infirmary because not having any friends, he didn't have anything else to do?
Possibly.
That looked like visiting somebody in the infirmary who was having stomach problems sounded like the bright lights to him.
Right. But we were there for one another when we needed to be, and I think that was. I mean, we were like that in high school too. I mean, he went his way, I went mine, and yet when it was important, we came together, and I'll never ever forget that friendship.
Yeah. So Charlayne, you've talked about PTSD. You've talked about you're having stomach problems. You've talked about, and Calvin mentioned the defensive crouch. That was his phrase for Hamp. Did you ever feel that defensive crouch? Did you ever feel in physical danger when you were on campus? And how important was your sense of humor for you to cope with those stressful times?
Honestly, I cannot remember ever feeling in danger, not even when that rock came. And I was rereading my book the other night, and Bud's, a rock and then a Coca-Cola bottle, I think, was thrown through my window. I don't remember feeling afraid ever. And I think part of that may have been my training. I'm a PK, a preacher's kid. And my parents, made sure I went to school, Sunday school, and learned all the Bible verses. And I remember coming out of the dorm after the riot had been broken up with tear gas. And the next day there were pictures of me holding this Madonna in the car with Dean, and says, well, it must have been really scary. And I said, scary? No. And they said, why not? And I focused then. I hadn't focused on what was conscious, but what was unconscious was one of the things my Florida grandmother, my grandfather was the minister preacher, but she was the saint. And when I was 5, 6 years old, she used to make me learn Bible verses. And one of them was, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Now, who wants to be bothered with that when you'd rather be climbing the mango tree, outside of the house, or playing games with friends? But she insisted, and I think that I call that armor. And I think that both Hamilton and I, in different ways, I don't remember Hamilton, Bud, you might remember him being religious, but I remember I was very religious at the time and always had been one way or another. And so that was the kind of thing that helped me get through all of that,
It was relatively scary, I guess, outside. The frat boys, because oddly enough, I think the whole thing was organized mainly in the law school of all places. But they had a lot of fraternity boys, and everybody kept saying that the Klan was coming. That's when things would really start, that the Ku Klux Klan would be there. The frat boys called the Ku Klux Klan Tri Kappa. I think the tear gas, I think that the police weren't doing a lot, but the change in the riot, if that's what it was when Dean Tate showed up. And Dean Tate could almost single-handedly stop something like that, which I think he did, which shows that they weren't really, it wasn't like the crowd that just went into the Capitol. They weren't, that they wanted to show some resentment, but not, I don't think that they were really murderous.
And I think also, pardon me, Valerie, but we're talking about something that happened 60 years ago. But I think that I'm so grateful that there are people who are tuned into this discussion, maybe not because I have anything specifically wonderful to say or insightful, but because I think we all need to sort of focus on where we are now, where we've been, some of the challenges we had, and how we overcame them, because Bud alluded to what went on in the Capitol. And while we never expected to see anything like that in this country, we have seen evil people do evil things, and we've seen good people work against that. And so I think that when you read Bud's book, I think it's important to focus on what relevance it has for today, as well as what lessons it has for today.
Yeah, I think we've obviously come a long way in the sense that you actually would have broken the law to go to the University of Georgia without the federal court, and caused Georgia to abandon what was then called massive resistance, with that wonderfully named law that the governor put in, was called the Freedom of Association Child Protection Defense Package. That was its surrender. So we don't have laws like that now. But in the book that was collected, Stories I'd Done on Race, there was a piece in 1975 about a white cop shooting a black suspect. And when I reread it, I realized it could have happened last week. I mean, there's some things just haven't changed. And we go on these plateaus where we say, oh yeah, now I realize what's going on. But then there's nothing for another couple of years. Then something happens to change it. But definitely had a long way to go. But I remember when we were driving back from Athens once, something hit my windshield. It was a pebble or something, nothing, it didn't break the windshield. But the first thing I thought of is that, oh my God, they're shooting at us. Because the idea then that if you were hungry on the way, that you could stop and get a hamburger, that would have been an act of not just bravery, but kind of a foolhardy act. And even if you were just hungry, didn't want to cause any trouble or anything like that. So that's changed a lot. But we have a very long way to go on all of this stuff.
The other thing I want to say, though, while I talk, and I agree totally with you, but the other thing was that while Hamilton never made a single friend at Georgia, over the years, he and I came back many times to remember in the best possible way our experience, what we thought we might have contributed to the institution, opening it up for other students who look like us. And I've seen, I don't want to turn this this computer around so that you see all the papers that are everywhere, because I'm trying to organize, like everybody else, self-quarantining, trying to organize my papers. But I keep coming across little pictures of us. And one I came across the other day with my young children and Governor Vandiver, the governor who had said, no, not one, meaning of us.
Not one, no, not one. That was his
not
motto.
one, no, not one. And 40 years later, I remember that was our 40th anniversary, and it wasn't the first one that Hamilton and I had come to, but he was there and he apologized. And while I think it's going to be difficult to accept some apologies these days, and I'm not going to go into who I'm talking about at the moment. I'll let Bud do that if he wants to. But I think that you can get a sense, I think, of when people are being earnest. I remember Vernon Jordan told me once that he was on a platform. You know, he went on to become a lawyer and then head of the Urban League and so many other amazing things, successful international businessman. And you know, he was talking about Governor Wallace. He had spoken somewhere in Alabama, and this was after Governor Wallace, somebody had shot him some time before that, but you might remember exactly when. I don't remember right now, but he had been shot. And Vernon said he finished on the panel and he happened to look over and he saw somebody sitting in a wheelchair just slightly behind the curtain. And when the whole thing was over, this guy rolled out in this wheelchair over to Vernon. The crowds had started to dissipate. And it was Governor Wallace. And he was coming to tell Vernon that he was sorry for the way he had behaved and the positions that he had taken all those years when Vernon and so many others like Constance Motley and Don Hollowell had to fight to get equal rights for all of us. So, you know, we just have to be careful and listen like Bud used to listen very carefully to see who's telling the truth and who isn't. Let me put it that way, because some aren't. But I think that in our situation, we could see Vanderbilt would not have been there had he not wanted to come and say what he had said. And I think that's very important.
Am I wrong, or didn't his daughter help organize the 40th?
Yes.
Vanderverse, I think.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
Yeah, I think it's important to, like you're saying, Charlayne, acknowledge that people can change over time and they can change their views.
Yeah.
Some people. So I want to come back. Let's put a pin in that. I want to come back. I have a question for you.
I shouldn't have gone out. I shouldn't have gone down that road anyway.
I have a question for you about that. But before we move into the present, I wanted to ask you both about Athens. You know, UGA was being desegregated and there was resistance to that. But there was also the town of Athens, which was still a town in Georgia. And so, you know, but what was it like for you to be staying in a hotel in Athens, being around town, interacting with citizens, some of whom were not in support of desegregation? What did that feel like to you? And then Charlayne, you can also speak about did you ever step into Athens away from campus, or did you pretty much keep your sphere limited to Athens? So Bud, you go first. What was it like for you to be in the town?
Well, I was used to, in those days, your views on race in the popular imagination were tied to your geography. So if you were from the north, you were I won't use the phrase lover, and also I think a large number of white people in the South, including fairly decent people, I don't mean just Klansmen or something, believed that the Black people in the South were actually pretty happy, and that the whole thing was caused by agitators from the North, and reporters were the worst sorts of agitators. So I was used to handing my copy into the Western Union guy and getting a baleful stare, wondering whether it was going to show up. That's probably where they made that silly pretty mistake. Guy trying to sabotage my copy. But Athens was just a regular town. And I remember when, I think it's in the book, one of the foreign students, I think it was the Ford Foundation, had this sort of cockamamie project at one point where they decided they would look at the soil and weather conditions of a country and send them someplace in the United States for school that had the same conditions. So there were Sikhs at the University of Georgia when Charlayne and Hamilton went. And one of them apparently went to the foreign student advisor and said, he had given up his religion and he wanted to take his turban off. And the foreign service student advisor said, "Oh no, don't do that," because he knew if he had without a turban, he was going to be treated as a black American. There was a wonderful story in Atlanta. There was a woman who taught, I think, at Clark College, one of the Atlanta University things, who was sort of an intellectual and hung out with this mostly white but passed for intellectuals in the Atlanta crowd. And they used to go out, and the story was that they used to go to Hart's Peachtree, which was then the fanciest restaurant in Savannah, and she would pass by wearing a turban and speaking Spanish. And the thing I loved about the story is, what country is that? The turban in Spanish. I mean, but she was foreign. And unfortunately, I checked and found out that that story was not true. That's why I've often suggested that at Columbia University in the journalism school, over the door, etched in the concrete, it should say, "Too good to check." I don't know what your experiences were in Athens, Charlayne.
I didn't have any. I didn't have any experience. I mean, here's the thing. And you know, again, I said earlier, I'm a preacher's kid. So I'm going to go back to a biblical saying, the Lord works in mysterious ways, because I wanted to, you know, get started as a reporter. And so I went to the college newspaper, the Red and Black University newspaper. And at that time, Tom Johnson, another student who later became head of CNN, is like got to be a really big deal, and is a really nice guy. Really, we've been friends over the years. So this is a semicolon, not a but. So I go to work, hoping to get an assignment so I can start practicing reporting, and there were no assignments because so much of what was going on in Athens, and Athens was still segregated. So, I mean, there were even bowling classes that I couldn't take. I didn't want to take physical ed anyway. And so when they said, "Well, what do you want to take?" And I said bowling, because I knew I couldn't take it because bowling was in the town, but the town was still very segregated. And so for a little while, I would do little errands around the office, you know, little filings and stuff like that, but that wasn't getting me anywhere. And then what happened was the Atlanta student movement burst into fruition. And so I would go home on the weekends and get assignments from Carl Holman and Julian Bond and the people who had started a newspaper to cover the activities of the students. And so while I don't know what kind of reporting experience I might have gotten had I stayed at the Red and Black, probably none, but some of the best pieces that are going to be in my book, by the way, Valerie, that I have ever written, I think I wrote during those weekends home, going to Carl Holman's basement and working with Julian Bond. The students would go picket in the morning, they get arrested in the afternoon. They were getting arrested so they could make a case. And then they'd come to Carl Holman's basement at night and tell their stories, and Julian and I would write them up. And so in a real sense, as I said, the Lord works in mysterious ways, because I don't have anything that I could show that I wrote while I working for the Red and Black, because I never wrote anything. But I've got all these things that I wrote for the Atlanta Inquirer, because Athens, you know, there were Black families in Athens who were very hospitable to us. But, you know, after the case was over, you know, we had to come down there for a week for the case to be heard by a judge, Judge Boodle, who eventually had us, ordered us admitted. But other than that, I mean, there was nothing to do in town other than to go to a Black family's house. But then as a student, there was no reason. I didn't have any reason to go to somebody's house, you know, because I would go from class back to my dorm room and work. And I want to say one more thing. There's a great, you saw it, Valerie. You saw Summer of Soul, which premiered at Sundance the other night. And I was blown away because I didn't know what they were using from my interview, but they included how one of the ways that I managed to get myself through all of that was while the girls were upstairs pounding on the floor to make me uncomfortable as possible in those early days. I said, I wasn't paying any attention because I was listening to Nina Simone on my record player, which was absolutely true. That they were featuring her at this concert in Mount Morris Park in Harlem in New York. And they cut away to that. And it was just such a moment because it was so true. It was so true. Hamp had the football players in the hood, and I had Nina Simone in my room.
That's great. That's great. So one question from the audience: how soon can we buy your book, Charlayne? When is it going to be out?
Oh, that's a very good question. I'm in the process of getting a University of Georgia student. You are helping me with that. Find some of those articles from the Atlanta Inquirer because I haven't been able to find them. So we'll get those. And I think it's going to be several months, but believe me, I'm gonna yell it from the rooftops when it comes out, because I think if I can say this, I think that those experiences I had in those early days helped me to appreciate the importance of doing the kind of reporting that Bud did, and doing it for people who were not getting that kind of attention. That is Black people. And I extend it now to people of color, but at the same time, you know, we see even today the disproportionate impact of everything relating to this COVID crisis, relating to the economy, everything that you can see. Black people are and people of color are disproportionately and negatively impacted. So what I'm trying to do in this book, which is what I tried to do throughout my reporting career, although I reported on other things as well, is to report on people who look like me in ways that are recognizable to themselves, so that they're not caricatures, or they're not prize fighters, you know, a single person, you know, getting a prize and being heralded for that, or one going to prison for some outrageous crime. But to talk about them in ways that are recognizable to themselves. And so I hope before the end of the year, let's put it that way. And you're going to help me, Valerie.
Yes, I am. I'm honored to help you. So going back to what you said earlier about, you know, people having the ability to change, and you're having the ability to accept apologies and to forgive. I guess I want to ask you two questions. How does it feel to be treated with so much respect now by the UGA, which in the past did not treat you well? And related to that, how are you able to, you know, come back year after year and be such a devoted bulldog? I know I've heard you bark, and I know you can bark. You can bark with the best of them.
Yes. Where's
So,
my mask? I don't know where I put it. I had it, but anyway.
You can bark without it even.
Yeah, I can bark without it. But you know,
my question is, like, how do you maintain, how do you come back to UGA with that lack of bitterness?
You know, I had a wonderful experience when I was at the University of Georgia. There might have been things that I wasn't able to do, like the first term, we couldn't go to the cafeteria. I also had a young white friend who this would come and see me and from the North and try to be nice. And at some point, the guys in his dorm said, it's either her or us. And he actually came and told me, he was practically in tears and said, I'm sorry, but I can't come back anymore because I got to be here 3 more years, you know. And so it hasn't been difficult for me to come back. In fact, it's been beyond difficult. It's been a real pleasure for me and my husband and my children. We were all there. When was that? A couple of years ago for a big event, and I organized a bunch of the civil rights workers from Atlanta who had been active when I was at the University of Georgia. And also from the very beginning, there were professors. I mentioned Joe Schwartz, who did this portrait, and his son is now reaching out to me through emails wanting to talk about his father. And there was, I had a Lothar Tresp, who was one of the, what is he, history, one of those called civilizations of something. But I had some good professors. I had some who didn't talk to any of us students. And then I had one, Dr. Best, and I'll never forget this. We had to do an assignment once. We had read the Iliad or the Odyssey, one of those two, of Homer, and he had asked us to write a description of the sword of that one of the goddesses had made for her son. And I go back and look which one it was. It was Achilles or one of those. I can't remember now. But so I had read it, and Homer had spent page after page after page describing this shield. So I said, well, what am I going to say that Homer hasn't already said? Well, 2 years before, a year and a half before I was admitted to UGA, I went to Wayne State in Detroit. And I used to go to the museum there, and I fell in love with Hieronymus Bosch. And so I got back to my solitary dorm room, and I was sitting there, and I started writing about how this painting, how this sword, shield, reminded me of the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch. And I went on to talk about Hieronymus Bosch. So now, meanwhile, not a single student in that room had said a word to me the whole term, and neither had the professor. One day he comes in, maybe 2 weeks or so after the papers had all been turned in, and he came in with the papers. And he said, so Miss Hunter, that's the first thing he said. And the students said, oh yeah, he's gonna get her now. And he said, so you think the shield of whoever it was, Agamemnon or whoever, said, I have to go look it up. But anyway, he says, reminds you of the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch. Now, not a single one of those Georgia girls and boys in there knew who the hell Hieronymus Bosch was, you know. And I thought, oh God, he's really going to come down on me now. And I said, yes, sir. He said, well, and he put the papers on his desk, and he said, it's one of the most brilliant papers I've ever read. The room was hushed. When the class ended, I can't remember now how many students, but I was surrounded by those white students who had acted like I wasn't there the whole time up to that point. Could we see your paper? Who, you know, it's amazing the kinds of things that led to breakthroughs. And that was one. And so there was never a time, there may have been a time as I talked to Bud that I did there were times when I would get back to my room and look in the mirror and realize I hadn't uttered a word the entire day. And you might have thought I was losing my mind, but I would say, hey girl, how you doing? You know, just but thank God I had a sense of humor. And so even though there were times that were challenging, I never felt really totally isolated. And I always had friends that I could call on. Some of the teachers, some of the women teachers, English teachers, Miss Wallace, Frances Wallace, lived right across the street and she would let me sneak over there and come up to her apartment, and we'd sit and have cake and Coca-Cola or lemonade or something. So I had a very different experience than I think Hamilton did. But having graduated Phi Beta Kappa under all those terrible circumstances, he was able to go on to Emory and be received, well received there, I think, and realize his dream. Thank God he realized his dream before he had to leave us.
Yeah. I have two final questions to wrap up. First one for you, Bud, and this comes from one of our viewers. What did you see in Charlayne's voice as a writer that struck you beyond your friendship and knowing her as a friend? I mean, by the time you two met, she was an aspiring journalist, and she's talked about you being an example to her. But what did you see in her that helped you to know that she could become the extraordinary, journalist and citizen that she is?
Right.
I really want to hear this.
What did Dwight Eisenhower say when they said, could Dick Nixon be president? And he said, give me some qualities that made you think he could be president. And he said, if you give me a week, I might think of something. But she was, the first things I read of hers were about her own experiences. There was one about visiting her, I think, her grandparents' grave in
Covington. Yeah.
Covington, yeah. So I thought that she could transfer her own experiences to paper, which some people can do and some people can't do. And also, she really wanted to be a reporter. She wanted to be a writer, and I think that's about half of it, of people who succeed at doing it. Because if you look in those days at that blank piece of paper, or these days at the blank screen, it takes kind of a leap of faith to write something down and assume that anybody's going to be interested in it. Yeah, I would have predicted that she'd do all right, which she has happily done.
Yeah, great. So Charlayne, couple of interrelated questions. Do you think UGA has done enough to kind of address its history with racism? And there's a comment from a student that I want to read to you. It's really poignant. She says, this is not a question, but thank you so much for taking a chance with your life, ultimately to take a stance at UGA by attending here. I'm a freshman and get scared sometimes, but after listening to you, I got motivated to be an even better person and believe in myself. So the question related to that, so first question, is UGA doing enough? And second question, how did you focus on your thirst for learning with everything swirling around you? And what would you advise students today who are dealing with, police killings of unarmed Black citizens, who are dealing with, marauders parading the Confederate flag through the Capitol? There's a lot that our students are dealing with now. What advice do you have for them for staying focused on their studies as you did back then?
Well, I think to the first question, I think that the University of Georgia itself has said it wants to do more and is putting things in place to do more. They are in touch with me and so many others, I'm assuming, on a regular basis. There are African Americans and people of color working there at the university to ensure that it expands its embrace of students of color. And I'm happy to say that while there are still challenges, there are organizations, Black student organizations that are there that are working with the students who might have issues, who might need advice, who might be afraid. There's a critical mass. It's not enough because it doesn't yet reflect the percentage of Black people in the state, but it's doing so much better than some of the others. And having the consciousness that it needs to do better, to me is taking it a long way down the road. The other thing that I've been very pleased to see, and you and I work on this fund that my husband Ronald and I started called Giving Voice to the Voiceless. And what has become so clear to me, and I think that Georgia University is probably now a microcosm of our society, and something that we need to focus on. And I think that maybe UGA can do some creative things that will help the entire country, because what I noticed as you and I and Parker Middleton were going through the applications, is that the voices now are people of color. They are Black people, they are Latin people, they are gay people, they are people of every representation of our humanity. And I think that, you know, what University of Georgia can do now is something that this entire country needs to do, especially our leadership, is to recognize that mixture of people, so that you don't have the Latins over here thinking one way about what's progress and what's important for humanity and justice, and the Black people thinking something different and them clashing. So I'm thinking that our university, woof, woof, can be a microcosm of society, is a microcosm of society. And those students there, and I've been exposed to them, and I know how sharp they are. They can help this country be what it needs to be all that it can be. And so I'm very pleased that the President Moorhead and Alton and everybody who's been involved in the 60th anniversary effort. The president spoke about it the other day in his state of the university. So I'm encouraged, and I know that life is a road that you travel, and you're gonna stumble from time to time on a rock, or you're gonna stumble on your own 2 feet somehow. But you have to, that's the other thing about this book of Buds, that you need to look back at history, because as I've said so many times, you're probably tired of hearing this, but our history is our armor. And so when we go back even to the 1500s and when the first slaves came over, and look at all the things. Last night I'm looking at television, and there's on I think it was who was it? Stephen Colbert, doing something funny about this whole issue of putting Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. Well, guess how many people probably don't even know who Harriet Tubman is. So, I mean, right there at the university, we can do things that will help illuminate our issues. And I'm so impressed with the students I've had contact with on these platforms that you and I've been a part of, and some others that you haven't. They're going to do all right, and they're going to help us get through and get to the next step, where one of them will write Bud's book and one of them will write my book. But right now, I want mine out there first.
Yeah. Thank you both so much for joining us. We could talk for another hour, but we need to wrap up. And I just appreciate so much your comments and your presence in the world. It's so great to be on the planet with you all at the same time, and to be inspired by your work, but also by the example of your lives. So thank you both very much.
Thank you. Great to see you, Bud. Great to see all of you.
Nice
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all so much. Thank you all for joining us.
All right.
Have a great evening.